Okay. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to Safety National's webinar on building return to work strategies for claims success. Today, we'll walk through several elements, such as why it's important, the costs, how we overcome barriers, and of course, the strategies we can utilize to effectively help all parties involved. Aaron and I wanted to start off with some brief introductions on who we are and what we do. My name is Dan Clayton. I've been in workers' comp claims for coming up on 17 years, with nearly 10 of those being here at Safety National, and the prior 7 being with a large carrier as a frontline claims adjuster where I got to handle the day-to-day items. Here at Safety, I am one of our senior claims managers, specifically overseeing workers' comp claims in our large casualty unit. As an unbundled carrier, we work closely with TPAs to assist with oversight of large deductible claims for our insureds, the employers. What this means with this type of business line is that if the claim is reportable to us and we're getting involved, the injuries are typically substantial in both scope and exposure. So we see a wide range of complex losses. Now I'll let my co-host introduce herself, and then she's also going to kick off our first topic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Grozowski. I am the Risk Control Product Manager for Safety National. I have been with Safety for the past 4 years, and I focus on working with our vendor partners to provide resources for our clients. So, primarily resources that help our clients reduce their risk, maybe their work comp claims, um, different things like that. My introduction to the industry was actually with a carrier managing or handling work comp claims as an adjuster. So I did that for about 6 years. And I then transitioned over to the employer side. And for about the next 6 years, with a few different employers, I managed their work comp programs and handling the work comp claims, being the liaison with the TPAs and the carrier. So we're kind of telling you our backgrounds because today we're pulling from our different experiences from claims and the employer side of things and the carrier side as to why this topic is so important about return to work strategies for claims success. So we wanted to kind of give you some statistics to start off to let you know why this is so important. So, according to the Washington State Department of Labor and Injuries, the chance of an injured employee returning to full employment after a 6 months absence is 55%. After 1 year away from work, the chance of returning drops sharply to 32%. And then after 2 years away from work, the chance of returning to employment falls to a meager 5%. So we really want to make sure that we can get these employees back in a timely manner to help make them successful. In a 10-year BLS study, they found that approximately 30% of employees that are injured on the job lose days away from work. According to the RAND Institute, having a return to work program reduces the length of an injured employee's absence by an average of 3.6 weeks. So we want to give you some tools to have that great program so you can definitely reduce the time off work for your employees. And there was also a BLS study of employees that showed about 80+% of injured workers would rather return to work than collect disability. They're motivated, they want to be working, they want their full wages. So we want to work hard to get them back to work. Now, it's easy to say we want to get them back to work, but there's definitely obstacles in the way of the employer and the injured worker and the carrier trying to get them back. So, one of the first obstacles that might be encountered is the medical providers. So, sometimes it's very difficult to secure that light or full duty release, especially with the initial visit to the doctor. Depending on your state, you may or may not be able to direct medical care. The employee may have gone to an emergency department that's not familiar with filling out, occupational health forms. So, they may not give you that return to work slip. So the nurses, the claims adjuster, the employer, everybody's working to get that return to work release, which can delay things on your end. And then there can also be a lack of details for what the employee can physically do. So sometimes there's a lack of detail on that light duty release from the doctor, but then also there's times where the employee lets the doctor know, hey, this is my job. I lift 50 pounds and that's all I do. And the doctor may be like, well, you can't do that. You're off work. When really the employer maybe has some light duty that the employee could come back to. They're just not even aware of it and they don't mention it to the doctor. So that can be a barrier. Legal is obviously a major obstacle in workers' compensation claims. So, attorney representation can have different implications from lack of direct contact with the employee, from forms. You got to fill different things out. You got to make sure you've submitted the correct form in order to move forward. And then there can be different changes with physicians. So an attorney may send your employee to a different physician, you've sent them somewhere, there's a conflict of opinion. All that type of stuff is going to be an obstacle in getting your injured worker back to employment. Another obstacle can be the employer accommodation. So, as we mentioned, it's great to have light duty positions, but not all employers are going to have a wide array of light duty positions or even light duty at all. So, that can be a barrier. And there can also be limitations to the duration of those restrictions. So, while the employer may be great at accommodating for 3, 4 weeks, they may not be able to sustain that long term. And then an employee may have to go back off work until they can find another light duty position, or maybe their restrictions are lifted somewhat. So, one of the last major obstacles is the employee capabilities. So, their transportation modification to their routine can be a major obstacle. Maybe they are used to working at 7 and they have a carpool, and that's when they always report to work. But this light duty position starts at 8, and now they suddenly don't have transportation, and their motivation and shifts in their attitude or morale can also really affect the employee returning to work. They may not be motivated to come back. Maybe they're not happy with the light duty, or maybe they just physically feel that they can't, and then it affects their mental status as well. So, along with these obstacles, is then there's going to be costs associated. So, I'll pass it back to Dan to kind of get into some of those costs.
Thanks, Aaron. Workers' comp claims are certainly not cheap, and the costs involved can vary wildly. These costs, however, go beyond actual dollars and cents, as Aaron was just alluding to, and can easily extend further into the intangible aspects for the injured worker, the employer, and even coworkers of your organization. Starting with whether a claim is litigated or not, there was an interesting Clara analytics study recently which examined nearly 51,000 work comp claims from all around the country. It found approximately 28% of all claims had legal involvement at some stage. And as you can see here, the effect that litigation alone had on the files was drastic. The average litigated claim cost was nearly $78,000 versus nearly $16,000 for the non-litigated ones. This means the legal factor caused the cost to almost quintuple, or in other words, equate to a near 400% increase. Next, we have medical. Stats and research have proved that regardless of what state you're in, medical, on average, is far and away the single most costly element of a claim. Recent AMA data showed an average 4% annual increase on medical treatment costs between 2021 to 22 and again from 22 to 23, along with an 8.4% increase in prescription costs. Now, these alone don't sound that dangerous or high, but remember, these are year over year like compound interest in a bank account. So at 8% a year for 5 years, you're not looking at a 40% increase, but closer to 50, which only becomes more exponential the longer a claim is open. Production. So this can differ significantly from one industry to the next, but the impact really cannot be ignored. When an injured worker is out for any time period, it affects the responsibilities of those closest to their position. Employers may need to hire additional staff, even on a temporary basis, and you can see notable reductions in output, whether that's the speed of serving patrons in a restaurant or working on an assembly line, which can cause a cascade effect of negative outcomes that we want to avoid. Employees changing shifts, such as day to night or working unexpected overtime in unfamiliar territory, can add an extra layer of risk as well. This is even something we hear from our insureds, the employers, occasionally on the stated reason of why a subsequent accident occurred. Next, the benefits to the injured worker. There can be multiple stages of payments in a work comp claim, starting with temporary total disability, representing when the individual is totally off work. And you'll note here, though, looking at the three examples, even after we hopefully get that person back to work, that does not automatically mean in any way that you're done paying them. If they're not earning the same pre injury pay in their new position or hours, you're paying partial wages for that as well. Ultimately, at the end, they could receive a rating for their injury from the physician, which can be a costly lump sum payment or paid over time. This is why it's so important to achieve mitigation for everyone in the initial stages to get someone back to work. Because even after they're back, you could be looking at several months or even years of additional benefits. Of course, this is not an all encompassing list that we're doing here today, it's categories and examples. And depending on where you are in the country, there are other considerations like cost of living adjustments or life pension that can also arise from the more complex lifetime injuries. Lastly, but certainly not least, as Aaron was just alluding to, morale. This is a huge aspect, honestly, of what we're going to be talking about today, and it can affect every single stage of the process. The morale, and specifically the attitude or motivation of the employee, is typically proportional to their decision making and thus their productivity as well. So we'll go more into morale and how we can help people with that later, but let's move on to the next slide of a cost example. Okay, so what we're looking at here is a small case study on one of our actual recent claims, showing the power of a light duty offer. In this example, we had a California claim with a strong wage earner being paid at nearly $1,000 a week. The injured worker did not have an overly complicated accident or injuries. There was potential, and they were actually released to light duty within a decent time period of about 9 weeks. We had also confirmed with the employer that positions were available within their restrictions, which is always a positive start, as that's not always the case. However, in this case, due to some minor conflicts, the employer refused and stated they just didn't want to make an offer. There are many reasons we discuss with our partners on motivations of the employer to take someone back or not. We can hear they don't want to go through the process of retraining, they don't want to create a new light duty position, or it doesn't seem worth it as they're expected to be back to their normal job within a month. Unfortunately, in this example, 2 months later, when re-examining the options as the employee had worsened, the employer's light duty options were filled by others, and our attempts of job creation were not successful. It happens. Ultimately, it took 97 weeks total to be released to full duty and stop wage benefits. If a job had been offered, you'll see over on the right, the cost of TTD, the lost wages, would have been under $9,000. But instead, the total cost was nearly 10 times at over $95,000. Hindsight is always 2020, but these are elements that are important to know what the potential risk is. We'll talk more on job offers as well and how to avoid this situation. But the takeaway is that the power and importance of a job offer and making that a priority cannot be overstated. I'm going to hand it back over to Aaron so we can dive into the good stuff, strategies.
So now that, like Dan said, we've told you a little bit about some of the obstacles and the costs, we want to give you some tangible strategies that you guys can implement in your own return to work programs. So, first, you want to make sure you've got a detailed written policy. And all of your return to work programs should have the same objective of returning the injured employees to full health and productive work while mitigating the risks and costs associated with the workers' compensation claim. You want to make sure you're stating this objective clearly in your policy and then outline the step by step process that will help you achieve it. And you want to make sure you're including each stakeholder's role and responsibilities because you want to make sure everybody knows that they're responsible for certain things and it's not just written down and no one's aware of it. And it's also good to have a policy acknowledgement form that employees can sign, acknowledging that they understand and received the policy for return to work. That being said, this likely is going to happen at the time of hire, and they may be thinking, I'm never going to get injured at work. So, as we'll mention later, it's always important to continue to remind employees of this policy, at different stages of their employment. So, another key thing is utilizing a work comp employee advocate. So this is a dedicated employee that's going to focus on injured workers and their return to work progress, and it's key to a successful program. The person's going to be their go-to contact for all questions related to the workers' compensation injury, and this person will stay on top of work releases and communicate with the injured worker often. This is really going to allow the company to know what's going on at all times and allow the injured worker to feel heard and seen so that they know there's someone that they can go to if they've got questions about it beyond just their supervisor. The supervisor is great to keep apprised of different changes, but it's always good to have that one person that's, it can be within HR, it can be within your safety department, however you kind of have your program structured. It's good to have that dedicated person. So, as I kind of mentioned, you then want to make sure you're communicating the program beyond the initial receipt. You want to make sure that employees, managers, your insurance carrier, healthcare providers, and if applicable, labor representatives are also aware of the policy. You want to make sure they've given a copy of it and they've got a description of the processes to be followed and key contact information. Because once established, you want to review the program with all employees and management on a regular basis to ensure the process is understood and followed consistently. Because sometimes injuries are rare in your organization, which is a great thing, but that means when one does happen, you want everyone to know, to be on the same page and to know who we go to, what doctor we send our employees to, if you're allowed to send them to a certain location. I know not all states you can do that, but you know what paperwork they go with. That's a important thing as well, is to having standard forms that you send the employee to the doctor with so you can make sure your questions are getting answered by the doctor. That's another important piece of this. So, in the next step of your successful program, you want to make sure that you've performed a job analysis on the jobs that your company has. You want to create a clear picture of your core requirements, and it should include information about responsibilities, skills, tasks, outcomes, and the work environment for each position. It's critical to evaluate and define the physical demands of each job within your organization, because once that's complete, you'll be able to utilize an employee's work restrictions to find a position that may be suited for them until they're released to full duty. And in addition, you can also use the injured employee's physician releases to maybe find a different light duty job and create light duty jobs. While the job analysis may help you find ones that already exist, you can also maybe come up with some opportunities for different light duty positions that are available for you. And as a caveat to this, if you're struggling to do this in your organization, you can reach out to your carrier. There's different vendors that can assist in performing job analysis, and that can help with really fine tuning the process and make sure you've got everything reviewed for your company. And then the third key piece is reporting your success metrics. So metrics like claim duration, cost, lost work days, return to work claims percentage can help evaluate your program success. And then from there, you can take those valuable metrics that you've recorded and you can use them to communicate key performance indicators to management and illustrate your program's impact and value to senior management. And this might assist you in some different requests you might have. Maybe you're showing, hey, we've been getting people back, we've been saving money, and we would like to use some of that money saved towards this different loss prevention um, program, something else to help make your organization even better. So these were mainly internal strategies that the employer can focus on to build their return to work program. And Dan is going to go over some different claim strategies for you now.
Thanks, Erin. Okay, so now that we know more about strategies for a program, let's look at the claim ones as well. Starting off with one of my favorites, nurses. I know for the experienced folks in the room, nurse case involvement is a well-known tool that likely needs little introduction. However, it's how we are specifically utilizing them that really makes the true difference. You have options always when it comes to nurses, as they can primarily be telephonic based, field based, attending appointments, or even what people reference as full case nurses who do it all. When an employee is off work, especially when the reason is not the lack of light duty being available, but the physician instead stating that they cannot work in any capacity, a field or full case nurse can be invaluable. Step 1, we want to coordinate with everyone in securing a job description which is as detailed as possible in explaining what the employee actually does on a day-to-day basis, and then give that to the doctor. As Aaron was just outlining, there are job analyses that you can do. These are the specifics that are crucial in clearly communicating what that person does and how we can help them. If multiple physicians are involved, such as different body parts, which is not uncommon, share with all. Don't just fax it or mention it at the start of the claim, but truly discuss it at different stages. Why is that important? Clarity of understanding. The doctor understanding clearly what the job title means, and more specifically understanding really how unique the details of the employee's physical responsibilities are. Some jobs like truck driver inherently have at least a foundation of what it may entail, although they still differ. But someone involved in a processing plant, labeled as a tree stand hanger, a real one I have right now, is about as ambiguous as it comes. Similarly, while discussing the details, communicate the availability of any modified work positions to that physician. What will the employee be doing? What's really required of them? How much do things weigh? What extent of their shift will be sitting or standing? If you walk through this and set expectations together on return to work timing, you can make effective goals. This is something I would do in my prior adjusting life and what we talk to our TPAs about. You can create a return to work letter or template with goal dates to be clear on duration of disability. And ask the doctor to list what it should take to have this person back into a position. And then the bonus is when that time comes and you have a reminder to talk about it again, you can readdress possibilities. If you're not securing a return to work release from the physician, ask why. Ask questions. When discussing limitations by nature, people use limiting or diminishing language, like they don't, they can't, they won't be able to. It can be dismissive. Instead, ask what the employee can do. That's something that I hear from our nurses a lot that is really effective, regardless of how small it is. If you reframe the narrative, you can help reframe the outcome with everyone. Second opinions, another powerful tool to reframe possibilities and expectations. As we know, despite our best efforts, some doctors may present continual obstacles and just not answer our questions, or seemingly go well beyond traditionally expected disability periods. If you're on week 30 of someone being written totally off work for a minor strain, for example, it may be time to engage a different specialist. Now, in states which allow you to direct care, you can simply select another provider. However, if that's not available, scheduling a formal or legal version of a second opinion with something like an independent medical exam or IME can truly move the claim in a new direction. You can do the state equivalent if it's not an IME, which is your next best bet. These can also widely vary by state for the protocols and frequency of what you're allowed to do. California, for example, one of our highest volume states typically, they're not even called IMEs, but things like a QME for a qualified medical evaluation or an AME for an agreed upon one. If you have a litigated case, an AME is more powerful as it holds more weight with the court since both sides agreed on the physician choice. These are important elements to consider. If you don't want to move the person away from the primary treater, you can still obtain a second opinion. We talk to our nurses about this as well. Schedule a peer review with another doctor of the same specialty, if and where allowed. This enables a fresh pair of eyes and different framing of treatment recommendations, which we've utilized to great success, whether you're talking about focusing on work capabilities, the actual physical restrictions, or even the type of a surgery that's needed to get the employee back to their best possible condition. Next, we've got claim strategies part 2. Legal engagement. When litigation is involved, coordinate with defense counsel on all of your major decisions, whether it's advice or tips on jurisdictional requirements, types of forms to file to be effective, or selection of physicians for one of those second opinions I just mentioned. When there are conflicting opinions of what your injured worker is capable of, the specialty, the strength, and the reputation of your star physician witness can literally make or break your case. Not to mention, the evaluations themselves can be thousands of dollars. So you want to be efficient and not have to do multiple unless absolutely needed. So it's really a true investment towards the outcome of your claim and should be treated as such. These defense counsels also often know, at least on a professional level, the attorney representing the injured worker. One of my favorite questions that we ask defense is, what do you know about this person? The answer to that can lay the foundation on how to communicate effectively in order to be transparent on work availability and expectations throughout the claim. Prepping the injured worker for return to work. This can be a complex multi-stage process. The physical or mental challenges the employee may have gone through post-injury can truly be the definition of life-changing. Do they need a wheelchair? If so, do you have a ramp ready? What other medical equipment needs to be secured proactively to set this person up for success? These are valuable questions that the claim handler, employer, employee, nurse, anyone should be discussing as a team. We often tell employers to be creative with position modifications, but keep in mind there's a limit, especially depending on the state. Certain state work comp statutes may include language about work modification to ensure that what is offered to the worker is seen as purposeful. We just had a defense firm, in fact, visiting our office to talk about this very issue in Tennessee. Counting paper clips, somewhat of an on-running joke in the claims industry for a mundane, unrelated job example, or something other made up position can be a faulty, misguided attempt to stop lost wages and try to motivate that person back to full duty. Instead, it creates the opposite effect. And it can be damaging to both morale and your return to work efforts if and when it's rejected. Don't make your new position punitive to the very person we are all trying to help. And always send all job offers in writing specifically to the employee and or attorney. That eliminates potential misunderstandings for timing and duties involved and prevents future disputes if the person chooses not to return. Not everyone is going to comply with what you have available, and we should be prepared for that. Lastly, we have vocational rehab. We're going to look at different versions of return to work scenarios here in a minute, as it's important to remember that there's always a possibility the injured worker simply can't go back to their old job. But there are options. By performing a proactive labor market survey, once you know the employer cannot accommodate the employee's needs, you can fairly research what else exists for them. COVID and work from home have expanded possibilities drastically in the past couple of years. And by utilizing a vocational rehab program, if retraining is needed, you can successfully get that person into new employment, whether it's with the insured or elsewhere. So let's look at some of these scenarios. Number one, transitional placement at the original employer. I'm not going to individually read these boxes, but I'd ask to draw your attention for each of these to how the steps actually play out. They're chronological. This starting scenario is really what most people envision when they think of a standard type light duty return. The individual stays employed throughout, and any temporary position or modifications are at their initial work location. So now Erin's going to comment on the next two scenarios for us.
So, another scenario for return to work is the transitional placement off-site and then eventual return to work at the employer. So, this often occurs in an industry that maybe makes it hard for there to be a light duty position. And if they can't bring their employer back to light duty, rather than have them off work, there's the option of using a vendor to find a transitional placement, typically at a nonprofit organization. So, for example, I worked in an industry where we provided truck drivers for clients. So the trucks were not ours. The truck drivers did not report into a central location. They went to the client, did their truck route, went home. So because they were spread out across 50 states, there was no location to bring them in for light duty. The client wasn't offering light duty work for them. So in this sense, we used a common vendor for this transitional placement, and the employees can work anywhere from dog shelters to Goodwill. Sometimes it's folding clothes or helping customers, or they're, walking dogs or, feeding them. And so it can be that meaningful, rewarding light duty work, especially in this case when you know you're helping others because it's at a nonprofit, but still allows the employee to be in a routine, showing up every day, but again, flexibility so that they can make their physical therapy appointments, make their doctor's appointments. But just wanted to point out that this is a alternate option that employers can take advantage of. And then, when the worker returns to full duty, hopefully they do, then they will be able to return back to their pre-injury job. So that's always the best case scenario. And then, we wanted to make it known that it's not always the perfect ending. And, there is an option where, an employee gets off work. Maybe they come back to light duty for a little bit at the employer or somewhere else. But basically, when they get released to MMI, they've got permanent restrictions and the employer's not able to accommodate those. So that's when you're going to key in that vocational rehab, or maybe before Dan said started early, but you'll start utilizing that to help get them a position at another company with their permanent restrictions. Obviously the key for all of this is to get that employee back to work. We don't want people off of work for the rest of their life. We want them to be able to come back to some sort of meaningful job. So we've kind of gone over obstacles, strategies, and we wanted to kind of remind everybody that there's a human element to all of this. That it's really about a person is injured, a person needs help. It's not about, getting them back as fast as possible because I need to make production goals. While yes, that's important, the main piece of it is that someone was injured and we need to help them. And really kind of reframing that that's the key piece to it can really help an overall return to work program, um, by helping out, your employees in the long run. So something that, if you've got that employee advocate or whoever's handling, the claims at the employer, sending things like get well cards if they've been off for a little while, or maybe they just had a surgery, calling them to check in, making sure they feel valued and that they're missed at work can go a long way. And really talking about empathy. And so making sure that empathy is involved in the different parts of your work comp program, and you're handling whether from the claims adjuster side or the employer side. So empathy can help build stronger relationships, and it can help the injured worker build a relationship of trust where they can count on their care team to provide meaningful resources for their recovery. If they live in a rural area, maybe they're having trouble accessing care, they may ask for assistance with transportation needs. Maybe they're struggling with adapting to a wheelchair and they could benefit for some home modifications. When they feel that empathy and they feel cared for, they're going to be more willing to cooperate. It may be less likely to engage in litigation. Another thing that empathy helps is reducing that negative thinking. So, following a catastrophic injury, an injured worker may likely be overwhelmed with the recovery path ahead. They could be facing years of treatment, surgeries, lifelong disabilities, and as a result, their mindset can be fraught with anxiety and fear. Excuse me. Their care team, including a field case nurse, as Dan mentioned, are crucial to restoring hope through compassion and empathy and encouraging positive thinking. And it can greatly impact how much effort the injured worker puts into their recovery and their willingness to succeed. Another way that empathy can help is it can improve treatment adherence. If an injured worker feels that their healthcare professionals and nurse case managers are not listening to them or prioritizing their care as an individual, then they may be more likely to skip appointments or fail to comply with their treatment. Unfortunately, many patients feel unheard, and there was a recent survey stating that 52% of individuals in the US had symptoms ignored, dismissed, or not believed. And healthcare without empathy represents a bandage approach, ignoring the holistic well-being of the injured worker. Another key piece of empathy is supporting the family morale. So, in addition to the injured worker having lots of things happen to them, it also can be a psychological impact beyond them. It can extend to the families, and they can be living in fear and devastation. Maybe their main breadwinner is no longer making the money that they were making before. So listening to the needs and understandings of their struggles from the family perspective from day one can provide a comfort in a desperate time and need, and can be key support structure for the injured worker, which will help enable um, a better recovery. And in addition, empathy can foster a positive work environment. As Dan and I both touched on, the morale of the employee and their attitude is going to be key to them enjoying their modified duty role. It's going to be key to them wanting to come back to work. They may struggle with their limited abilities, but an employer willing to empathize with their challenges can make all the difference. It can boost their morale when they feel heard, increasing their productivity and opening the lines of communication long term. So we want to pivot to from the empathy and how important that is to sharing some success stories of how some successful return to work programs and claims handling, how they've panned out.
Thanks, Aaron. All right, continuing on a positive vibe, we're going to start our wrap up with success examples because who doesn't love a good underdog story? Both of these that we're going to share are actual Safety National claims from the past 2 years. For the first, we had a retail worker in Michigan who was walking across a parking lot to provide a customer their pickup order. Sadly, she was struck by a vehicle from someone not paying attention, which threw her and caused severe injuries. These included, but were not limited to, a fractured skull with a brain bleed and 4 other bilateral lower extremity fractures. She required surgery, multiple surgeries, and by all accounts, a typical claims professional would read this and think one of two things, right? This is either going to be a permanent total disability case or at least a multiple year recovery. Thankfully, and to her credit largely, she shattered expectations and returned to work with her same employer only 6 months from the date of injury, which is almost unheard of. The positive influences that we wanted to highlight, which were quoted by those involved, included many of the powerful things that we're talking about today: a field case nurse, clear, regular communication between all parties for return to work goals, and repeatedly talking about everything at each stage as you move through the treatment, and the employee's raw, incredible attitude and motivation. This is not something that we see every day. So these shining star examples are ones to really kind of use as a case study. You can look at the details of what resources were utilized and why they were so effective. If we go to the second one,
Sorry.
this success story, similar in many ways, had a vastly different time frame. A traveling employee from Maryland was rear-ended on the highway and also pushed off the road into a guardrail. By no surprise, she had several significant injuries, including bilateral arm fractures and disc involvement in both her low back and neck. She ended up requiring 2 different neck surgeries for fusions and hardware. So again, if you stop right there and you hand it to a nurse or somebody and ask them what's going to happen, the outlook is a pessimistic one. But the positive influences here, very similarly, were a field nurse who ended up really being a full case advocate for this individual. Strong attorney coordination. It was litigated for really 2+ years, uh, and the claim lasted 4 years, with strong attorney coordination on her personal needs, and we utilized vocational rehab as well. She finally returned to work 39 months, over 3 years from the date of injury, which, if you recall the stats from the beginning of this, really probably had about a 1% chance of actually happening. This shows not only the raw perseverance of what we can accomplish, but demonstrates just how long success can sometimes take. It is not a 6 to 12-month process for a lot of these more complex injuries. So let's wrap up with a few things. How do we summarize this for these success steps? We just talked about a lot. We need to be prepared with a robust return to work program, as Aaron described, so you can get ahead of the ball for when those bad claims happen. We need to be cognizant of the typical costs and what potential obstacles may be for the claim when it arises, and especially state-specific information about where that occurred. We need to be proactive with developing strategies and tailor fit steps of what you're trying to accomplish to the unique obstacles involved. Not every claim is the same. They are wildly unique, just like we are. And we need to communicate regularly and openly with all parties along the way. And we need to be empathetic. That's really kind of the capstone on what we're talking about today with the injured worker and with everyone involved so we can work as a team. If you're passive in an approach, your claim or injured worker could easily become just another statistic that we're talking about and a potential loss to the organization. But when you're proactive as a team and engage these resources that we're trying to outline, you set the tone. You can retain the individual and you can create your own success stories. So this concludes the primary material that we had. Aaron, you looked like you may have wanted to say something before we move on to questions.
Oh, nope. It was about questions. So we've got a couple rolling in, and I was going to start with those. Feel free to send them through the chat, and they will get passed along to us.
Yeah,
Um,
it looks
Go
like we're
ahead.
right about on time. We wanted to get that done with you guys for within about 45 minutes for the primary material. So thank you so much for joining and listening. We did bake in 15 minutes exactly for this for Q&A. Um, and I've seen a couple come through already. So if you have a few additional minutes, feel free to stick around. If not, no worries. Take some time back for your busy schedules. But let's start looking at what we have.
Do you want
Let's
to go,
see.
Dan, or do you want me to read one?
You can start. Let me
Okay.
look at this for a
So
second.
this is a super easy one, so I'm going to start with this. Someone asked what type of common vendor helps with the transitional placement. Um, so the one of the major players in the game is called reemployability. It's a mouthful, but that is their bread and butter. With what they do is help out with transitional placement for injured workers. Workfinders USA is also another vendor that does it. Those are just the two I'm super familiar with, but I know that there's other ones as well. Your carrier TPA should probably have a list of them that could help you as well. Well, I'm not sure if you are employer what you are, but that they'll be able to help out too with that.
Okay. I've got one here. Some of these are lengthy. Well done, folks. How do you address potential risks of re-injuries when an employee returns to work? You got difficult claimants. I'm paraphrasing here. That may, yeah, there's a risk, right? There's a risk of subsequent compensable consequence type injuries when returning to light duty or alternate work. These types of claimants, would it be better to just pay TTD instead of dealing with multiple body parts? Um, Fantastic question. It's really what we describe with our partners is don't get bogged down in the hypotheticals. And people talk about this all the time. Is there a risk if I've got my arm in a sling and I'm trying to go to some light duty position that because this is totally immobile, I can have an overcompensation claim for the right side 3 months down the road? Yeah, of course. That's always a risk. But think back to the TTD example that we did and think back to the statistics of the motivation and morale killing elements that can occur when that person is just sitting at home. They're just watching TV. You're going to get a litigated case every time when they're watching attorney commercials. So, yes, we would always advocate for getting the person back to light duty, but focus on the right light duty job and how you accomplish that together.
So I think this one's more of a comment. They were going to ask about reaching out to the injured worker, and then I think we talked about it, but she was saying, or he, I'm sorry for saying she, they said, I never heard from my employer, and it upsets them when you can gain so much better goodwill through even the smallest effort. So yes, totally true. If they don't feel that anybody's asking about how they're doing, or those little touch points can go a long way.
Got another good one here, and this is asked a lot. Can the employee refuse the light duty if outsourced? Like in the example of they didn't want to work at a nonprofit for this transitional job placement. The very short version is yes, of course. Any employee can refuse, has the right to refuse work that you offer them. However, that has implications and consequences depending upon what jurisdiction you're in, right? So there's a lot of states where, as long as you have this light duty job, it matches the doctor's restrictions, and you offer it to them in writing with a set date and all the details and the expectations, and they say no, okay, you can just end lost wages. And when you do that, that is a strong motivator for the person to comply um, in order to get back to something because they need to. Uh, there's states, I won't go too deep into it, but there's states where you actually have to file form work to end benefits. So there can be kind of a transitionary period itself where you offered a job and you can't just end benefits, so they string it along. But yes, right to refusal is a big thing, but it comes with consequences for them.
So I have one that said you discussed having an employer advocate to respond to all work comp questions. While I agree with an advocate, I believe this individual should focus on employment concerns and the claims adjuster should answer claim related questions. Would you agree, or do you think the advocate needs to be a work comp claim expert as well? I think overall that makes sense. Obviously, especially depending on your makeup of your employees, you may not have someone that's been a claims adjuster before, like I was when I switched to those roles, and so they may not know the ins and outs. They probably know a lot though about jurisdiction, and they should know how much the employees are getting paid. They should know their wage amount. So I think they should be able to answer those questions. Um, but I definitely think having that, having communication with the claims adjuster to have more specific claim related questions, they can always say, I can reach out and ask them. Because I think something we found a lot is the claims adjuster may have so much on their plate. They're traditionally have a large volume of claims, and we would have employees be like, I call mine and they never call me back. And then that's going to lead them to wanting to get an attorney. And that type of thing can be avoided if you can kind of have that buffer person help out, like, well, let me get the answer to that question for you. So I don't think they have to have the deep knowledge, but they can always get the answer for the employee. And it's just kind of having an extra person helping them would be good.
Exactly. Um, Another good one here. What would the tax implications, I'm not a CPA, by the way, be for transitional employment vendors? How does that work? Yeah, so we discussed this with our insureds. Really, to Erin's point, if you recall specifically what she was talking about in scenario two, when it comes to volunteer positions, because you're placing the injured worker at this transitional job that is a volunteer basis, say Goodwill, for example, and it's volunteer level work, it's not that site or location that is paying them. And so it shouldn't be too complicated when it comes to the taxes. Oftentimes, most of the time, the examples that we see, it's the employer themselves that is opting to pay that individual. It may be at a reduced rate because it's light duty and it's at an outside source. But because the insured, the employer who's retaining this employee, is the one paying them for the work at the volunteer location, taxes and those sorts of implications from payroll are widely similar to what they would normally be. Obviously, states are going to be different, locations, et cetera. So, a good thing to discuss with the people involved on a case by case basis.
Someone asked, do we need a return to work program policy in place prior to trying it out with employees? I'm assuming that maybe you kind of mean you don't have light duty currently, so you don't really bring people back. So I would say yes, I would formalize what you want your policy to be before just kind of bringing people back. You want to make sure everybody knows what it is. You don't want to let one person do one thing and another employee do something else and then feel that somebody's getting preferential treatment. I would really build out the policy before trying something out, if that's kind of what you're asking.
Okay. Um, we've got a great list going here. Good job, guys. There was one, I won't read this two paragraph intro. This was a lot of specifics, and I thank you for it. Essentially, the question is if you have a nurse involved and the claimant, the injured worker, or somebody talks about, oh, I don't think their involvement is necessary, or there's pushback in some way, well intended or not, what do you do? Do you keep that nurse on the file? Great question. It really, this is one of those, it really depends answers. Do I find that scenario common to your question? Not really. It's few and far between, thankfully. Most people are going to accept the help that you provide them, especially at no cost to them. Do they feel awkward, or do we get feedback occasionally of, I didn't really like this nurse being present at my appointment? Sure. But you can come up with compromises to still have that expert involved where they don't have to sit in. They can sit in the waiting room, obviously do a private exam, and they talk to the physician afterwards. They can be as involved or as not involved as we find success with to help that individual.
So I got one that said, lately we are getting modified duty requirements that are very hard to meet. Lifting of less than 5 pounds, breaks every 10 minutes, no driving and no more than 4 hours of work. Would you still recommend trying to accommodate? Um, I think it really depends on your industry and what you guys have at your employer. If there's really no meaningful work within it, um, then if you really can't accommodate, maybe you can't accommodate. I mean, the no driving would require you need to provide them transportation, um, no more than 4 hours of work. I mean, I think that might be a good candidate for maybe that transitional placement. Maybe you guys don't have it in your industry, but maybe they could do that at a nonprofit. Working just those half days, getting them in some sort of routine. Because hopefully those severe restrictions are only for so long. Dan, do you have anything to add to that one? I think that kind of plays with you too.
That sums it up pretty well. I was mostly listening to you do your thing while I'm reading 17 other
Sorry.
questions, but
Sorry.
no, you're fine.
Really limited
Yes,
restrictions.
yes. Um, all right, so here's another one that we get a lot. How long should an employer hold a position open when a person is recovering for an extensive amount of time? That's $1 million question. The simple answer is it's entirely up to the employer what they can accommodate in the situation if they want to retain that individual or not. It really becomes a flow chart, right? Of like if then questions. Are they motivated to retain this individual because they're a strong worker? If yes, okay, great. What concessions can we make for them? How long can we hold this position? If the position gets filled because of a business need, are we going to have something else available for them? So it's a growing conversation over time. There's no one set answer of saying, oh, I'd make it at least 6 months or you'll have a legal hassle. Every state's different, but that's the sort of element that we're talking about to discuss with everybody. So you have a defense answer, you have an employer answer on what they're able to achieve for that person.
Um, so someone asked, what about union shops? How does that affect return to work? My short answer to that is you do have to check with the rules of the union. Um, I think they might have more. I mean, like Dan said, anybody can say no, but you are able to allow them. You can still offer light duty. I personally don't have a ton of experience with union shops, so that's something I can look into as well. Dan, I don't know if you have any experience with light duty and unions, but
Not hugely, other than to just say, as a claims expert, there's a lot of challenges. There's a lot of delays. There's a lot of union legal needs and hoops sometimes that you have to jump through, which are good, that are protections for the workers. I'm not, saying anything against unions, but it adds an extra unique element of an obstacle to sometimes overcome from at least a timing perspective, because you have to follow the law and the letter to go through and make sure that everything is up to par for what the union requires. So as long as you're upholding that and you're following that process clearly, it shouldn't really be an issue. It's not a precursor to or a restriction of that person going back. You can still have people go back.
Did you
Um,
have another one, Dan?
I've got about 17. We're not going to have time to get to every single one, so I apologize in advance. But these are fantastic questions. I'm trying to combine some because so many have to do with timing. What is the recommended time frame to offer modified duty? And I think what they're trying to say, the clarification point is we have employees going beyond 60 days. So what is the recommended time frame, possibly a limit of when a modified duty may expire? Again, entirely up to the organization. It's about what the employer is able to do and still meet their business needs. There is no requirement or typical law or statute of limitations in a state when it comes to comp that says, oh, well, by the fourth and a half month that this person's been in this light duty position, you either need to cut them loose or get them back to, their normal job. There's not a deadline in place. So you can have a lot of freedom in what you're offering your employees.
I just have one more, Dan, so I'll jump in and do it, and then whatever we have time for left.
Okay.
So someone said some of the positions in my organization cannot accommodate restrictions. How do I offer another position that is less than their current position? Um, so I'm assuming you mean less pay than their current position. Um, and uh, light is, and assuming this is not permanent restrictions, that this is somebody that's just currently on light duties restrictions temporarily. I mean, you can certainly offer them to come back to work in a light duty position. There will be, as far as how pay works, I think that's different jurisdictions. I know some, what we did is, some employers choose to make up a difference. Some employers choose to pay them their wage they were receiving before. You can't pay them less than what they would get off work, of course. But I think that, and some states have certain rules on that, so don't, quote me on, you can do, pay how you want. But if this is a permanent situation, um, that's a different situation. You can't. They have to be able to be coming back to a similar position at the same wages. Dan, do you have some on that? I mean, but I don't know if you just mean just temporary light duty. You can always bring them back to different positions, and as long as you're paying, the wages, and there's that TPD, the supplemental. If you're not paying them, you're paying them a lower wage, but then you pay the difference to make up. I'm not explaining that very well, I don't think, Dan. You're more into
No,
that
you're
stuff now.
no, you're correct. And the key, folks, is really to, if you're considering a job offer, if you're considering any sort of modified duty, especially when it has to do with limited hours, a new position, new duties, something other than, hey, we have this very standard light duty position that's very similar to what they're doing before. Now they can just sit the whole time, or something black and white. The key is to just discuss. Ask your claims expert, whether it's your carrier, your TPA if you're working with one. Ask what the implications are ahead of time proactively to say, hey, I need to cut their hours. I can only accommodate 17 hours a week instead of 40, and here's what it is. I'm nervous or confused, and I don't know how this is going to play out from a payment standpoint. Open up those dialogues, and it's really helpful to achieve what you're looking for. Similarly, I have one that I was going to segue into. Are there minimum wage rates that must be paid to workers on alternate duty or alternative duty? Yeah, state minimum wage at a bare minimum. Yes, there are minimums. You cannot, because you're just creating a job out of thin air, you cannot make up your own rules. So that kind of goes back to the tip that I was sharing about engaged defense. If you have a defense counsel, you have an expert in the state of Maryland, wherever, um, and you need that question answered, again, talk to your experts and they can walk you through what will be required. Similarly, if an employer amounts excluded in calculation. Okay, if an employer continues to pay full wages, are these amounts excluded in calculation of the insured's X mod? That sounds like an underwriting question. I, I can't answer that, to be honest, but it's something to discuss with your carrier. There's always a resource, right? If it's a legal question, engage defense. And we tell people you don't have to have a litigated claim to talk to one of your defense counsels or firms that you're familiar with in the state. So a lot of these questions, it seems, which are fantastic, are talking about either state-specific things or what is the minimum, what is the requirement, how do I not get in trouble for X, Y, Z. Exact, perfect questions for your carrier, your claims expert, your legal expert, because they differ wildly from state to state, as we know. I've got two more, Erin. Do you have one
I'm
or two to
I don't
finish
have
off
any
on or no?
more. So go
Okay.
ahead.
What if the injured worker, this is a great one. What if the injured worker files a claim that they were injured at the alternative work position, i.e. Goodwill? You bought it. If it's legitimate, obviously perform an investigation. Do your due diligence, as we always recommend, to ensure that what happened happened. Do all the normal steps that you would on a claim that happened with the employer, right? So you can have that confidence. And yeah, if it's a compensable claim, or think about it this way in summary, if it would be a compensable claim at the employer, it is a compensable claim because they were working for the employer. They were simply at a different location. So you bought that extra body part. Two of these last ones are just comments, but they're great. Lots of people love nurses. There's lots of chiming in on nurses. So any nurses that are listening, we love you, clearly. Um, but I think that's really all we had. I know we're butting up at the end of time here, but unless there's a last minute question, again, thank you so much everybody for taking the time and listening. This is obviously an important topic that is near and dear to our hearts. So yeah, talk to all of your experts and reach out to us with anything else.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody.